Hello horror fans. Today I want to share a new batch of creepy stories I found on Reddit. If you enjoy this type of content, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. I used to work in a nursing home as a palliative care assistant. One night, I had 3 dying patients, and my task was to ensure their comfort in their final hours. The girls I worked with on the night shift were incredible. We always tried to make each other laugh to get through the night. I was known for liking to scare them. Sometimes I'd hide in the closet of a room where someone had just died. The body and belongings had already been removed and the room was empty. Press the call button and wait. The girls would rush in to turn off the signal, and then I'd jump out and scare them to death. One night, I was sitting at the nurse's station filling out a report, as I had to give narcotic medication to a patient named Kent, when suddenly one of my assistants ran into the room. She swore she saw my shadow on the wall, as if I were hiding to scare her, but then she heard my laughter at the nurse's station. I decided to check what was happening, since there shouldn't be anyone else on our floor. When I approached the wall and stood where the light could create my shadow, there was nothing. I laughed it off, when suddenly the assistant started screaming. I turned around and saw a shadow seemingly climbing up the wall out of nowhere. I just stared at it and said, "Oh, for God's sake, is this all you can do?" and went back to the nurse's station. After a while, I had to do my rounds. As I approached one patient's room, I heard 3 knocks on the patio door next to his room and saw an older man dressed all in black. I couldn't let him in because he didn't have access through there, so I told him to wait while I called a nurse, and when she and I returned to the door, he was gone. She went outside to check if he was still there, but we found no one. So I continued the rounds and entered the patient's room to check his blood. There was blood everywhere. The patient was lying on the floor, bleeding out. It seems he tried to get up but fell and struggled in his own blood, trying to stand. The nurse got him back into bed and we cleaned him up. There was nothing we could do, as he had a DNR, do not resuscitate, status, except ensure his comfort. I went to the next patient's room and he was dead. He had stopped breathing. I ran to find the nurse and took his chart. He also had DNR status. We notified the morgue and his family, and then, along with the assistant, prepared his body. Afterward, I went back to the patient who had fallen. His vitals had to be checked every 15 minutes due to the fall, and he was also dead. I called the nurse and she was upset, as this whole situation was taking 2 assistants off her floor for post-mortem care and adding a lot of paperwork. As I was walking down the hall to get linens, I noticed that same older man I had seen outside. He was passing by the nurse's station and whispered, "Just one more and I'm done for today. Just one." His whisper was so terrifying that I jumped and ran in the direction he was headed. A female patient's door slammed shut, and when I entered, the patient looked directly at me, gave a sigh, and died. Her eyes were still looking directly into mine. For some reason, I remembered the window in the room was open, and that seemed strange to me. I ran to it but saw nothing, and then slammed it shut. I checked the patient's pulse and there was none. It turns out the nurse had followed me and saw the same thing I did, and heard the same creepy voice. She turned the corner and swore she saw that man, and then saw me jump and run after him. She also saw the door to the patient's room close before I could enter. When I turned around and saw the nurse standing in the doorway, she could only say, "I saw that too. My God, I saw that too." I have an interesting story. A few years ago, I was studying at university with a friend I'd known since school. We weren't best friends, but we got along well, knew enough about each other, and talked without issues. I knew he was interested in spiritualism and sometimes talked about his spirit guide and similar things. It's not exactly what I believe in, but to each their own. And the thing is, we both spent time at the residence where I lived. He lived in another, killing time and watching nonsense on a small TV in the communal kitchen. We'd wait until 2 a.m. because that was when WWE, or WWF as it was called then, started. We didn't have cable, so we often waited at the residence and then went to a local 24-hour pool club where they showed Sky Sports. You could usually ask them to put the wrestling on and turn up the volume. We were chatting about whatever and watching something absurd on TV. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I know for sure it wasn't anything scary. We weren't drinking or anything like that. We were absolutely sober. When it was time to go to the pool club to make it in time for the wrestling, we put on our jackets and continued the conversation as we left. And here is where the strange thing happened. As soon as I crossed the threshold of the door, I felt a chill. It wasn't just cool. It was a penetrating cold that seemed to wrap around me. It was around 2 a.m. in spring in England, so the night wasn't warm to begin with, but this sensation was different from the usual. I got goosebumps all down my spine. It might sound cliché, but I can only describe it as a slowly growing feeling of anxiety, like when you're watching a horror movie and the background music turns sinister. I tried to ignore it, but with every step down the street, the feeling of anxiety intensified. The air literally felt heavy, as if it were harder to breathe. I know this sounds like another creepypasta story, but it's the only way to describe this horror I felt in my stomach. About a minute after we stepped out into the street, I suddenly realized we were both silent. We had been chatting and laughing as we left the residence, but our conversation seemed to die out on its own. I remember looking down the street trying to figure out if maybe I was worried about some suspicious figure nearby, but the road was empty. The night was clear, nothing unusual around, but an alarm bell was ringing in my head. I was afraid of something, but I didn't understand what exactly. Finally, noticing the silence, I just said, the air feels heavy today. By then my throat was dry. My friend looked at me with a pale face and uttered, "Oh God, do you feel that too?" We tried to talk about what it could be, but we both struggled because we were nauseous with anxiety. Finally, when we crossed the street, and I remember my friend turned even paler and said, "It's death. Death is here." Curiously, I remember almost nothing after we crossed the road. The terrifying feeling suddenly vanished, and we both burst out laughing, even though we had both felt it. We reached the pool club, and I didn't think much about it for a few days. A while later that same week, I was returning from university, this time without my friend, and was passing by a building next to the residence on that same street where my friend felt death. There were 3 police cars and an ambulance there. I watched in horror as 2 forensic doctors wheeled out a body wrapped in a black bag. The next day, we found the story in the local newspaper. It turned out that 3 homeless people trying to find shelter had died in that building, and their bodies remained there for several days before being discovered and removed. We never found out exactly what they died of. After that, I never went to watch wrestling again. I worked the second shift in a hospital that 90% of people consider to be haunted. I fall into that 90%. As you'll see, every building, floor, and practically every corner of this campus has its own haunting stories. I'm often walking alone. I'm a cleaner, which makes the situation even worse. at least when I start thinking about it. Usually, I try not to think about it. My personal story happened in the ultrasound diagnostic department in a radiology clinic. By the time I get to that area, the silence becomes suffocating and I can't help it. It's always scary there at night, so I just do the necessary work and move on. And the place is shaped like the letter J, a long hallway that curves. On the inside of the curve is the changing room, which opens into a mammography room and then goes back out to the top of the J. If you stand at the base of the letter, you can see through the doors of 2 rooms to the other end of the premises. I was there putting a bag in my cart when suddenly something caught the corner of my eye. I looked up, and through the changing room and the mammography room, I saw a person. They had long hair, but it was definitely a man. I snapped out of my numbness and ran to see if some stranger had snuck in, but there was no one there. I grabbed my things and ran out without finishing the job, because to hell with that. Another story, which isn't my personal one, is related to the 2nd floor of the hospital, and on the 2nd floor, there are only offices and computer labs. Everything is located along a single corridor that runs through the entire building. On one side are the elevators, and on the other are double doors leading to the computer lab. This floor became known as the domain of a being the workers affectionately call Matilda. The first story I heard of her was from a colleague who knew someone who worked on that floor. That person went there for some business and stayed late. Leaving the office and heading to the elevators, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye and turned toward the computer lab at the other end of the hall. He saw a figure that looked like a patient, a woman peeking her head into the lab. He went toward her and asked who she was and what floor she was from. She turned around. She had no face. The man from the office froze on the spot, scared to death. He wanted to run but couldn't look away from whoever or whatever was staring at him from the other end of the hall. Instead, he closed his eyes as tight as he could. After a few seconds, minutes, or however long it was, he opened them and she was gone. He said he had never run as fast in his life as he did that night and made it outside without even looking back. Another incident with Matilda happened when one of the managers left a recorder on in his office on the 2nd floor to record strange noises or voices. The next day, I was passing his office with a colleague and he called us in to listen to the recording. At first there was nothing, but then a barely perceptible voice uttered, "Turn that off." It was bone-chilling. This hellish hospital is full of stories, but I don't have time for more now. I'll be happy to share more later. Okay, I'm back with another story. I'm at work right now in the hellish hospital and remembered another story. Now I'm in the MRI department, where my friend, let's call her Sandra, once had an unsettling experience. Just like the ultrasound area, the MRI area sometimes creates a terrifying atmosphere. Personally, I've never seen anything here, but as I mentioned, Sandra had a similar experience. Sandra told how one night she had to come in to set up the MRI room. The area is shaped like the letter W. The central part is the workstation for the computers, and the side parts are the MRI rooms themselves. On both sides of the workstations there are windows through which you can see the rooms, and in each window you see the reflection of the window behind you. And that night, she was alone here preparing the machine and was half asleep. She started feeling that something wasn't right and felt a growing anxiety. This feeling was so unpleasant and heavy that she woke up completely. She looked up at the window facing the room and saw the silhouette of a figure standing in the corner. She didn't understand what that figure was and decided maybe she was imagining it. But remember, I mentioned you can see the reflection of one window in the other. She realized that the figure wasn't in the corner of that room. It was standing right in front of the window behind her and was looking at her. Now comes that same story I mentioned at the beginning. It's from this community and came out relatively recently. Well, here we go. This happened when I was at university, as I mentioned in my previous stories, and it was a period of my life when many disturbing things were happening to me. I don't know what I was doing to attract so many strange people at that time, but I probably should have reviewed my life decisions better. Anyway, on to the story. During my university studies, I worked as a tutor at a school, but on weekends, I sometimes worked as a babysitter for family friends. One of the children was already old enough not to need a babysitter, let's call him Chris, but not old enough to take care of the younger child, let's call him Kevin. So that's why I ended up there that night, which, to be honest, turned out to be terribly terrifying. I don't know, maybe it won't seem as scary to you as it did to me then. We'll see. So I was babysitting the kids one Saturday night. The parents usually didn't get back too late, are returning home around 10 p.m. or even earlier on the nights I watched the kids during their monthly date. But that night, there was some special situation. I don't remember exactly what now, but the point is, I was 19 and could stay late. They said they'd be back at 1 a.m. and suggested I stay the night, but I had already decided that wasn't happening. There was a strange atmosphere in that house. It was isolated, and there were many old buildings on the property. A silo tower, sheds, a huge barn, etc. Maybe I'd seen too many horror movies, but all I could think about was that there were too many places in those buildings where people could hide. Plus, the house itself was very old, and those houses always scare me because, ghosts. So I definitely wasn't planning on sleeping over. I was sitting with the kids, and Kevin asked me to help him find something in the basement. He had a bunch of costumes he loved to put on. Once he scared me to death coming up to me in the dark in an ultra-American costume or something. I always thought that clown costume was disturbing, but of course, it wasn't. That night I almost lost my mind. The basement was the second spookiest place in the house. The spookiest was, of course, the attic, because attics are always horrible. So if he had asked me to go there, it would have been a flat refusal. The basement wasn't fully finished and was quite large with many nooks, turns, and corridors leading to different rooms. It was the first time I'd gone past the stairs, and the whole time I was thinking that if I'd known how terrifying that basement was, I never would have agreed to babysit at that house. But of course, I didn't want to look like a coward in front of the kid, so I went with Kevin to his costume corner, which, of course, was in the deepest part of the basement. While we were looking for the costume, or rather, while Kevin was looking, and I was wondering what life decisions had brought me here, we heard sounds that could only be described as footsteps upstairs. First, I said it must be Chris, but then Chris suddenly appeared in the doorway, scaring me to death. Seriously, I have no idea where he came from, and said, "That's not me." I remember that moment very clearly. The three of us were standing next to that closet full of various and sometimes quite macabre costumes, in a small room in that suspicious basement, listening to what we believed were footsteps upstairs. Well, and this is how we die, I thought, accepting it in a strange and instant way. But that lasted only a second before I thought, to hell with this, and started looking for a weapon. This is where watching too many horror movies actually came in handy. Of course, there was nothing because it was a children's playroom, and in the rest of the basement, there weren't many things besides maybe the washer and dryer, which would be bad weapons unless I managed to push them onto someone, which seemed unlikely in that situation. In the end, I chose a random crowbar. Seriously, it was just lying on the floor, and none of the kids knew why. I can't explain how sinister that basement was. I prepared myself to face my fate, reflecting on how far I was willing to go to protect those kids. And at that moment, I realized something. The dog wasn't barking, and the family had a golden retriever named Lily, who barked at literally everything, and she was quiet. I started rationalizing the sounds as normal noises for an old house. Also, I realized that when we heard those sounds, we weren't actually under the house itself. Judging by the layout, we were under the porch, so even if someone was there, they weren't inside the house. It could be anyone. The most logical option was a delivery person. I felt a bit better, but you can be sure I didn't let go of the crowbar. Again, horror movies. They really prepared me for situations like this. The kids and I went up, where we found Lily sleeping soundly. Not like someone had knocked her out, she was just out cold. She woke up abruptly when I touched her because she was sleeping very deeply. At first, I even thought she was dead, because the night was heading exactly in that direction. Once upstairs, I went out to the porch and opened the door very carefully to check. Maybe there was a package. It was winter and it got dark early, so it was very likely a delivery person could be working after sunset. But of course, there was no package there. Of course there wasn't, because if it had all ended there, I wouldn't be writing this. Anyway, by then I was stressed, but the kids had already gotten bored with it. While they played video games and I searched Google for crime statistics in that small town, suddenly Lily became alert and started barking like crazy. A second later, someone knocked at the door. I just couldn't escape that circle of events that night. Grabbing the crowbar, I approached the door and saw through the frosted glass that someone was outside. I couldn't distinguish their features, but someone was there. Since I'm not a complete idiot, I didn't open the door, but I asked through it, "Who is it?" The man behind the door said he had a pizza delivery. You know what I'm going to say. We hadn't ordered pizza. This was before every kid had a mobile phone, so the boys couldn't have ordered it. And if I'm honest, they were so absorbed in the video games that they were totally disconnected from reality. And if the parents had ordered pizza, they would have told me. So naturally, I prepared again to fight for my life. Squeezing the crowbar, I told the guy we hadn't ordered pizza. I was sure he would insist and try to force me to open the door, but to my surprise, he didn't. He just said, "Oh, sorry, my mistake," turned around and left. By then, I had so many questions, like anyone facing a series of strange events in a spooky house in the middle of nowhere. That's why, when I saw that guy leaving the porch through the frosted glass, I opened the door slightly. I wanted to get a good look at him, just in case I ever had to identify him. But by the time I opened the door, he was already walking away, and I only saw his back. However, I immediately noticed two strange things. He didn't have any pizza in his hands, and I didn't see his car. The latter I could explain by thinking maybe he parked on the street, which would be weird given they had a large horseshoe driveway. But okay, maybe. But there was no pizza. Technically, it could have been out of my field of vision, but I highly doubted it. I almost shouted at him about it in a misplaced burst of courage, but then I realized that if I did, he would understand his plan had been discovered and he'd have nothing to lose. So I just closed and locked the door. Later that night, Lily was unconscious again, and the kids were sleeping upstairs. I didn't think I was going to sleep truly. I sat there with the crowbar in my hand, alert, as if I were going to fight for my life. Looking back, maybe it was a bit of an overkill, but I wasn't going to be one of those idiots who die for underestimating the threat level. I could have suggested to the kids that we split up, which I realized at that moment had basically already happened. Either way, they wouldn't have helped me much, though maybe Chris would, because he was 14, was my height, and could break a board with his fist. Maybe I should have kept him close. In the end, I drifted off for about half an hour, but I was woken up by the sound of an owl. I'm a very light sleeper, so either the hooting of the owl woke me up, or it was a simple coincidence, but I was hearing the owl when I woke up. Only the sound wasn't quite right. It sounded like an owl, but something about it wasn't right. Now, looking back, I realize what I did next was incredibly stupid, considering everything that had happened that night. But I guess my tired head just wasn't working fast enough. Fatigue is the real killer in horror movies. In my state of fatigue, I decided to find out what was going on. I approached the door and started listening. The owl kept hooting, and the sound still seemed strange. I couldn't understand why it sounded so unnatural. And then I did another stupid thing. I opened the door. With the door open, I could hear the owl a little better, and I shone the light from my phone into the darkness. Considering it was 2007, the light it gave off was very weak. Suddenly, I heard the owl again, and honestly, my breath caught, because in that moment, everything clicked. The hooting sound wasn't a real owl. It was someone imitating an owl. Even now, telling this story, I literally get goosebumps. Maybe it doesn't sound that spooky, but it was one of the truly terrifying moments of my life. My heart was just about to jump out of my chest, and I kept the beam of light from the phone directed into the darkness. And it was just then, when the light reflected off a pair of eyes that were at human height. And remember, it was 2007, so the light was terrible, and that meant the owner of those eyes was unforgivably close, although due to the darkness I couldn't make them out, and I didn't feel tired anymore. I regained my composure quickly, closed that damn door, barricaded it, and ran to the living room, having already checked all the windows on the first floor. I also grabbed a huge knife from the kitchen, something like Michael Myers' knife, because at that moment I was seriously thinking I might need it. I seriously thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That someone outside is making owl sounds and that something has eyes? They would have replied, "It's a damn owl, idiot," and probably would have hung up. So I just sat on the sofa, squeezing the knife and the crowbar again, and trying not to think about all the horror stories I had read or seen, especially those where the good babysitters meet a terrible end. But, of course, it was in vain. I didn't sleep a wink. Near midnight, the couple returned home. I texted them to warn them discreetly without revealing that I had completely lost my cool, which would have been an absolutely accurate description of my messages. I simply wrote that I had heard something outside and asked them to be careful when coming back. They didn't pay any attention to it because they lived in some strange world where bad things never happened to good people. They walked in totally calmly while I put away the knife so they wouldn't see me clutching it like it was a fragment of a shipwreck. It was just then that they told me a couple of nights ago they had heard someone walking outside, because of course, that's not information worth sharing with the babysitter beforehand. Why would I need to know that, right? I picked up my money, totally deserved. I swear, and rushed to my car to get the hell out of there. When I got home, I realized I still had the crowbar. And I'm not going to lie, I never gave it back. For their critical omission of information. I went through what was practically a real nightmare. So that crowbar, damn it, I earned that too. That was the end of my career as a babysitter. I watched their kids only once more, and it was for a real medical emergency for one of the parents. Fortunately, everything went well, but I couldn't say no when they called me desperate. Nothing bad happened that night, and thank God, because I don't think I would have had the strength to deal with that again. But even after all these years, I'm 100% sure of one thing. It wasn't an owl, and I thought it was an owl. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.